Okay, we are on. Hello, Eric.
How you doing?
Great, thanks for joining us. So tonight we're going to talk about SAM, which is Serve America Movement. It's a new third party that has emerged in the past several years. Before I turn it over to Sam, just want to remind everyone, as you know, we're 15 days out from November 3rd, and there are many voters who feel disenchanted or they feel like they're stuck in this two-party system that we currently have. I'm sure there's polls after polls that show that Congress is at all-time low in terms of its approval, and there's also a groundswell support of those who want to have some sort of a shakeup in the system by way of a third party, but we haven't seen that happen yet. So perhaps Erik could shed some light on his involvement with SAM. I think in any democracy, and some form of change or disruption is always good because you don't want to be stuck with the status quo that brings you nothing but just the entrenched interests. And we as an organization, we always advocate for critical independent thinking and not simply falling into the partisan traps, because the way how our system is set up is everything is pitted as one side versus another. So there's an issue presented and you're forced to take one side or the other. And I think that's really one of the reasons why we're seeing this dysfunction and tribalistic negative partisanship. So with that being said, before I turn it over, let me just introduce you guys to Erik. Erik is a lawyer and a financial planner, writer, and educator. He has provided political and financial commentary on numerous media outlets, including MTV, Time Magazine, Bloomberg, Fox Business, and Forbes. And he currently serves as the executive director of the Serve America Movement for the New York chapter, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So welcome, Erik. One more thing before I turn it over. What we'll do is Erik will spend some time discussing SAM, the organization and what it does and how the organization is involved during this year's election. And then I will do a brief Q&A between Erik and I, and then I will open it up to the rest of the audience. So at that time, you could chime in. So without any further ado, hello, Erik.
Great, thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for coming. So what I thought I was going to do, Thomas, can I show my screen? Would that work?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just kind of walk through some stuff that's on the website. Oh, actually, it looks like it's disabled. The screen.
Try again.
Oh, okay, here we go. Yeah, so if you can see, I don't know if people can see my screen, but so SAM was started after the 2016 presidential election by people in the business community as well as former staffers in both the Bush and the Obama administration. And people basically felt that the political system was very dysfunctional, to give us the choices that we had in 2016. And the question then became, well, how do we fix the system? And so this idea of having a new third party came to fruition. But the idea is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, how it's different from other third-party efforts that have been made in the past. But really, the whole focus is around fixing the broken political system. So it's all about process, not ideology. So SAM, which stands for the Serve America Movement, doesn't have a specific ideology. It's not a liberal party. It is not a conservative party. It is not even a centrist party. The idea is to try to help elect candidates who, number one, represent their constituents. So that means we expect that if a candidate is running in a very liberal area, like say in Manhattan, they're probably going to be more liberal. If they're running in a more conservative area, like where I grew up in upstate New York, they'll be more conservative, and that's okay. Second, we want these candidates to work together, to compromise and to listen to both sides and to come up with reasonable solutions. that represent the views of their districts, not to represent ideological fringes, not to represent partisanship, and not to represent big money, special interests. So if you think about, though, essentially it's trying to make democracy work the way it's supposed to work. And what are these red lines that are appearing here? I'm not sure what that is. But yeah, so this was started after the 2016 election. And the party is really focused right now in just New York and Connecticut. It's rolling out state by state. And in New York, we had a candidate for governor who is Stephanie Miner. She was the former Democratic mayor of Syracuse, run for governor, with Mike Volpe, who is the former Republican mayor of Pelham, running for lieutenant governor. And in New York, the way it works is if you get 50,000 votes as a third party, you can get automatic ballot status, meaning we don't have to petition to be on the ballot for the next 4 years. And so the Miner Volpe campaign was able to get enough votes to give us ballot status. Now, the interesting thing too about New York, which I think makes it particularly beneficial for a third party, is that in New York, third parties have the power of what's called fusion, which means that as a third party, not only can you run your own candidates, you can also endorse Democrats or Republicans or candidates of any party. And so what that means is we can pursue different strategies in different type of elections. And so in a race where it's very close between two candidates, where we have the potential, if we ran our own candidate, of being a spoiler, instead what we can do is endorse a candidate if one of them is much stronger in terms of supporting the type of political reforms that we support. And follow the process that you see here. Listening, defining the ideas, inviting collaboration, being transparent, being accountable. You can see the different requirements. This is on our website, joinsam.org, that we want candidates to follow. And in terms of a specific issue platform, it's really all about electoral reform, which I'll get into in a moment. But the key thing is that in those areas that are really close, we hope that we can be the swing vote. And this way we can put pressure on candidates from the other parties to support these types of reforms, to be transparent, to be accountable to their constituents, and encourage them, to basically be better representatives. Now, in other districts, you could have a district that's not competitive, where it's an overwhelmingly Democrat district, an overwhelmingly Republican district, where essentially there's no competition because the outside party is toxic. So in those areas, we see a particular opportunity to run our own candidates that won't be branded, with what people hate about Democrats and Republicans in different districts. And there we find that candidates are often, either if it's a Democrat district, they tend to be very left-wing. If it's a Republican district, they tend to be very conservative because they're mostly concerned about primary challenges. And in those districts, we think we can help elect candidates that are more in the center of those districts. So keep in mind, the center of each district is going to be different, which is, again, why we don't have a one-size-fits-all policy approach. And so that's kind of the electoral strategy. Now, in terms of what we're trying to do, is really reforming the system in a way that's not really necessarily liberal or conservative. So if you look at some examples of some of the policies here, open primaries. In other words, allow people of all parties to vote in a primary. And the big advantage of that is that right now, politicians are often beholden to the extremes of their party because they're so afraid of getting a primary challenge. And people that are in the middle of that district are often feel somewhat disenfranchised. And so by having this open primary, anyone, including independents, can help select, who those candidates are. Term limits to make the process more fair for people running against entrenched incumbents. Making it easier to vote. Removing obstacles to voter registration, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, online, early voting. A lot of these, of course, are big issues right now because of COVID, but we were talking about this long before that. Making election law enforcement agencies independent and nonpartisan rather than just bipartisan. Supporting legislation require ranked choice voting. We think this is a really important reform for third parties to be more competitive in elections. Because under the current system, it's actually rational for people not to want to vote for a third party because they're afraid of wasting their vote on a candidate who can't win, and therefore having their worst of evils have a better chance of winning. So in a ranked choice vote, instead of just voting for your first choice, you can also vote, your first choice and your second choice and your third choice. And this way, if no candidate gets a majority of the vote, whichever candidate got the least votes, those votes would then go to their second choice, and on until someone gets a majority. So if you really want to vote for a third party candidate because you feel like they're the best person, you can give them your first choice. And if nobody gets a majority, and your candidate is last, your vote will then go automatically to whoever you pick second. So this way you don't have to worry that you're wasting your vote or helping elect, someone that you hate more. And I think that will really make it easier for all third parties, not even just SAM, to be competitive. They have it right now in Maine. It's very new. It also, of course, was instituted recently in New York City, but only for primaries and special elections. So it's not really going to have the same effect of helping third parties as much in New York City, but I do think that's good because as people get used to the process, voting in primaries and special elections, it could eventually be expanded to general elections, and it won't feel as as scary or risky because people have gotten used to it. Getting rid of sore loser laws, that actually, we don't have that in New York, but in some states, they make it that if you lose a primary, you can't run as an independent. And sometimes that's, again, the more moderate candidate who better represents the district. And those laws can prevent them from running as an independent. A disclosure requiring super PACs to disclose all their donations online and within 24 hours to bring more transparency to the process so we know who is funding these super PACs. Ending partisan gerrymandering by creating independent, fully transparent redistricting commissions. That's another thing that can help elect more extreme candidates when you have these districts that are created to help the political parties, and so they're not competitive. And as a result, the primaries become the main way that candidates are elected. And again, that tends to favor the more extreme candidates. Supporting legislation to lower the legal barriers for minor party and independent candidates, which actually brings to mind a big issue that's facing SAM and all the third parties in New York right now, which is that there was a new law that was kind of snuck into the budget bill, which instead of getting 50,000 votes in a gubernatorial election to have automatic ballot status, now third parties have to get, I want to say it's 130,000 votes or 2% of the vote, whichever is higher in a presidential election, as well as the gubernatorial election, to stay on the ballot automatically. And that is a significant hurdle for all the parties, including SAM, particularly for us, because we never intended to run a presidential candidate because we're really only in 2 states, and that would have been silly. And so we are actually suing to have that law, at least that part of the law, overturned, because essentially they're forcing us to run a candidate in an election we wouldn't want to do. And I think that's a big issue right now for all the third parties who could face potential extinction if that law stays on the books. But it's very typical, exactly the type of thing that we're trying to oppose, where the parties are working together to eliminate or at least reduce their competition. And then, better enforcement of campaign finance laws by getting rid of various loopholes that have been created. Now, this is not exhaustive. There's other things like, for example, public financing of campaigns that some of our candidates support. There may be things that are more specific to local areas. But again, it gives you a flavor for the types of reforms that, again, are not necessarily liberal or conservative things. The idea is to fix the system, because if there's one thing that everyone from Trump voters to Bernie voters to people in the middle believe it is that the system is broken. Whether you want to call it rigged or you want to call it the swamp or however you want to frame it, there is a consensus, I think, across the political spectrum that the system is broken, and it's going to be hard to fix all our other problems if the system is not functional. Because you could have overwhelming support by people for different kinds of reforms to improve our economy and our healthcare system and whatever issues that you care about. But if the system is not reflecting the will of the people, then it's going to be hard to translate that support into actual policy changes. And that's why we're making this the focus. So it's like, let's put aside all our differences for just a moment. Let's make the system fair. And then we can fight about all those different policy issues on a fair playing field. And of course, we also not just want to fight, but also once the election is over, we want politicians who are willing to work together, that are willing to compromise. And that's why we have these other aspects to it as well. This focus on problem solving and not candidates that are just going to toe a party line. You can see here, one of our requirements takes no purist ideological policy pledge or inflexible litmus tests. Now, the candidates themselves are chosen by people that are interested in getting involved in SAM. We have local committees all throughout the state of people who interview the candidates, help decide the candidates. We have primaries, that are open, within our own party to choose the candidates. And so one of the things is, for people who want to get involved, sometimes they're afraid of changing their party registration because they're not going to be able to vote in the Democrat or Republican primary. But what I always like to say is the reality is people will have a much bigger impact in the SAM nomination process because we are so small and so new. Versus, one vote out of millions, you could actually really help decide who gets our ballot line for anyone interested in getting involved. The final thing, I think, unless I'm skipping something over, Thomas, I think you wanted me to talk a little about how I got involved.
We could get to that during the Q&A part.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's basically the overview of SAM. I don't want to just keep talking, so I would, like to open it up and see people's questions.
Sure. Before we get to the audience, just the follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up. When I first heard about SAM, I was, on one hand, very fascinated, but on the other hand, very skeptical, to be quite honest. This almost sounds like, if I could use a sports analogy, like fantasy baseball. You just put together your dream team, and you just hope everything works very well. So again, in a fantasy baseball world, that's great because you get to pick and choose who you want to keep on your roster. But in practice, I guess I'm a little skeptical because I know the nuts and bolts of SAM is really about fixing the process, but how do you entice voters? Because I think voters are attracted by issues and values. And to me, process is such a dry administrative and procedural component. I'm just not sure if that will energize voters.
Yeah, so I have two different answers to that. First of all, I do think a lot of people are energized by just how broken the system is. I think that fueled a lot of support, on the left for like a Bernie Sanders, on the right for a Donald Trump. And there are a lot of people in the middle who feel very disaffected by just how broken things are. And if that's why, I think if there's one thing people do feel very passionate about, it is just how corrupt and broken the system is. The second part, though, and to be realistic and to also go along with what you're saying, is, we don't need to have a huge number of people to make a difference, because if we're following, for example, a fusion strategy, which I think in the beginning is primarily what we're going to have to do, even a small percentage of voters voting on the SAM line can swing close elections. And if that swings elections to candidates who support these reforms and allows these reforms to be implemented, as these reforms are implemented, it'll make it easier and easier to get the other reforms implemented. So for example, if we can get ranked choice voting in, that would allow to get more SAM candidates elected. If we had public financing of campaigns, that would help more reform-oriented candidates get elected. If we made it the ballot access easier. So in the beginning, I think the key thing is just having, even 1 or 2 percentage points of people voting on our line, because that gives us leverage to, I don't want to say extort, but to pressure, politicians to support these reforms. Because I'll tell you right now, because I was very involved in this, the candidates that there were candidates all over the state seeking our line, including lots of incumbents. And they want to get on as many lines as possible. And one of the things we are asking them to do is support these reforms. So, even a small number of people can make a big difference.
So is it safe to say that Sam is sort of following the Working Families Party in terms of the process, not the ideology, because WF is obviously a very liberal party, but would you say from a procedural or strategic point, they are following that model?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on how you would characterize the Working
Yeah.
Families Party model.
So it'll be good. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it's something more like the unity tickets and building fusion, running on multiple lines. Now, that's only available in certain states. So in New York State, that's very common. But if you go to other states, they do not have these fusion ticket lines.
Yeah, so again, it depends on the district. In close districts, I think the fusion strategy is really smart because that's where we can make the difference in a close election. But there are also a lot of districts that are currently non-competitive. In those districts, we actually want to run our own candidates because number one, we're not playing a spoiler because these are non-competitive elections anyway. And number two, we have a better chance of winning because the out party is usually very toxic in those districts. That's a big difference from the Working Families Party, perhaps, where they don't have as much of that. Perhaps they don't have as much of that opportunity.
Okay. Now, as far as vetting the candidates, I know you had mentioned that there is a very kind of intimate process that's involved where the candidates have to appeal to the voters. But I think you also mentioned that there are no litmus tests. But without litmus tests, how do you vet these candidates? That seems like a double-edged sword.
There's no ideological litmus tests. So the litmus tests that we have are around things like transparency, where are your donors coming from? Are you kind of accountability and also support for these political reforms that are not ideological. So we're not going to have litmus tests on abortion and gun control and healthcare and things like that, because the idea is you want candidates that represent their districts. There are districts that are very pro-life. There are districts that are pro-choice. There are districts pro-gun and anti-gun, and that's okay. The interesting thing about SAM is you could have a position on any of those issues and still be part of SAM.
Yeah, and that's where I think this kind of fantasy baseball aspect becomes into play because, you're almost like realigning a lot of these individuals to assemble a team. And that's how fantasy baseball is. You have players from the American League, National League, and as you know, each game is very different depending on which league you play in. Yeah. So the question is, if you have like an assembly of different individuals who might be very conservative on social issues, but very liberal on other issues, how cohesive will that be as a political party?
So the cohesion is just a bit based around a different metric, right? It's instead of being ideologically cohesive, it's cohesive around these values of things like transparency, accountability, working across the aisle, and supporting these political reforms. Like that's the constant thing, and you can do that. There are people that could be on the far left, on the far right, and in the middle that could take that approach. In fact, that's what we want. I mean, if you think about what the ideal government would look like in many ways, you don't necessarily want it to just be all one or the other. The idea is to have different voices that represent different communities, because we want to give think of it this way, as kind of the ideal is to have each community be represented in what their views are, have those representatives come together and be willing to listen to each other and compromise. And without as much of the influence of money and special interests. That would be the ideal that we're trying to work towards, rather than saying one ideological perspective dominating.
Right. I think those are two different things. So again, not being dominated by big, corporate interest or money. That's one thing. But the
Yes.
second thing is having wide appeal to vast swaths of voters. That's great. And again, but I think when you have one party that's trying to do everything, that sounds like you're trying to do too much at once, and you're trying to please everybody. And usually in politics, when you try to please everybody, everyone is upset and no one votes for you. That's just the electoral reality. So how do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're not going to please everybody, because people that tend to be more on the extremes of their districts, which is an important qualification, because again, every district has a different center, are probably not going to be happy with our choices. People that organized interest groups that like the system as it is are not going to be happy with our approach. We're not, so I can't say everyone is going to be happy. But again, I guess the question is, what would be the alternative, right? I mean, I look at Sam, the way I would like to see is that when people go in the voting booth and they see the Sam candidates, they can say, okay, these are the candidates that are supporting this type of a process.
And is there some sort of a pledge that a candidate would have to sign just so that they could uphold certain, I guess, obligations to the party?
So we currently don't have a pledge, but that is something that we're discussing and potentially going to be rolling out and putting that together. But we don't currently have a pledge. What we said instead is, and it's basically kind of what I was showing earlier. It's we actually have a scorecard that can be used as a guideline for people to evaluate their candidates. And it's more of a guideline though. So if you're trying to decide between 2 or 3 different candidates, you can kind of go through the checklist and see which candidate supports what. But at the end of the day, it is the members of the party at the grassroots that are also making these decisions. But we don't currently have like a pledge that a candidate has to sign.
So this year, during the 2020 upcoming election, there will be a number of candidates who will be running on the SAM ballot line. And are there any names that we should be aware of? Any high-profile contests? Yeah.
Yeah. So let me, if I can, I'm gonna show the screen again if I can.
Oh yeah. Hang on one second.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you now to our New York site. Oh, hold on one second. So, and again, I am not saying that I personally support all these candidates. Part of democracy is that you don't always get, I mean, even within SAM, all the people that you support. But these are some examples of candidates that we've endorsed. And we have about equal number of Democrats and Republicans. And I want to say it's like 5 or 6 candidates that are only running on our line. Now, just by the nature of the elections that are up, these are mostly state Senate, state assembly races. There are a few congressional races, I believe, in here. But yeah, in terms of like really high profile, we don't have a candidate for president. There's no statewide offices. So these are all going to be, to some extent local. I mean, even the congressionals are, different congressional districts.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe there's a candidate who is running against AOC in the 116th district in New York. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Let me see if.
I believe her name is Michelle Caruso Cabrera.
Yes, there she is. I personally was not involved in that one at all because I don't live in the district. And that's the whole thing, is we want people in those districts that are helping select the candidates. So my role as executive director is more recruiting people, helping them kind of through the process and letting those people, helping them organize and helping them interview and choose their candidates in each of these districts. So, which again goes to the point that even if I personally or the other members of the executive committee in New York don't always necessarily support every single candidate here, because we are trying to have a fair, open process to let people choose. And we didn't even, by the way, intend to have it about equal, and it just worked out that it was literally 50% Democrats, 50% Republicans of the candidates that were endorsed by a major party.
I think another potential trap that I see, or maybe unintended consequence, is that you might have a candidate who runs in a primary, maybe trying to unseat the incumbent, but then he or she loses, and then they still want to be on a ballot. So they say, well, I guess why not just run on the Sam ticket, right? Because this will give me another shot. So doesn't that maybe expose Sam to having these candidates who may not have the integrity to campaign on these process reforms? Rather, they're just out there to win elections, to stay in power.
Well, but that's why the whole idea is we're not going to give the line to anyone, which is, again, why we have a scorecard. There is a process by which these candidates have to be nominated by the party. So it's not literally anyone who wants the line gets the line. So yeah, there could be a candidate, as you point out, who runs in a primary. In fact, that's definitely true for a handful of these candidates, lose the party primary and decide to run or continue to run. Usually they seek our line before they know the outcome of their primary, but they continue to want to run as a stand candidate. But if they fit our standards of what we're looking for, and if they're supported by the people on the ground, then to me, there's no reason not to support that candidate. Oftentimes the people we want are people who are not able to win these primaries because the primaries are often, dominated again by the extremes of their party or by interest groups that are very particularly strong, in those districts.
Yeah, and I think this 116th district race is pretty interesting because I did follow the primaries when AOC was running against Michelle Cruz Cabrera, and from what I recall, for the Democratic primaries, Michelle Cruz Cabrera was a bit more right of center, I guess. I guess she was not progressive enough. And now she's running on the Sam ticket, and she's going to say, well, I am in favor of transparency, all these electoral reforms. But then if you were to ask the same set of questions to AOC, she'd be like, oh, yeah, that sounds great. I'm for that, too. So again, to me, this you have two candidates that are different without much distinction. So can you explain how that would play out?
Yeah, so remember, it's not just supporting the reforms. The reforms are a key part of it, but also part of it is being able to work with people across the spectrum, working across the aisle. So that's another part of it. And I think that was a lot of the concern, particularly with AOC. I don't want to comment too much on that because, like I said, I was not personally involved in that decision process. But that could have been where, there were problems there.
Okay.
Because someone like an AOC, to your point, we do have candidates that can be really good sometimes. I'm not saying she is or isn't on electoral reform, but are less, the other part of it, which is, again, is working across the aisle.
Okay. You also mentioned about this idea of partisan purity, and that really runs deep on both sides. And it seems like voters are very skeptical whenever a third party or some think tank emerges pretending to be independent, but then it turns out that there are still, very strong alliances to one party or the other. One organization that comes to mind is the Lincoln Project. Mm-hmm. Again, when you look at these ads, which are very compelling, but it turns out that these ads are all cut by the likes of William Crystal and George Conways and others who were, the Republican classic, but they're just pretending, or they're trying to give off this impression that it's an independent organization. I know Earl is in the audience and he's going to respond to that later. But if someone were to, make a similar comparison to Sam, wouldn't that also expose Sam as being just another kind of like a spinoff from like a Republican centrist party?
So, I don't know that much about, the Lincoln Project, but my understanding, I could be wrong on this, is that it is kind of an explicitly Republican group that's trying to reform the Republican Party. That thinks the Republican Party went off track and is trying to, like, to quote, fix the party or change the party. But whereas with Sam, I mean, we are literally our own party, right? Now, yes, there are people involved in Sam, including our new executive chairman, David Jolly, who was a former Republican congressman from Florida, who left the Republican Party because he didn't, like the direction it was going in. But we also have people like Stephanie Miner, who is the person that's responsible for us having ballot status in New York, who was a very active member of the Democrat Party. So we have people from both parties that are involved in SAM.
Okay, so if I could ask more personal related questions. So how did you get involved with SAM?
So my background politically was much more in the Republican Party. I was the president of the College Republicans at NYU. I was the president of the law school Republicans in my law school. And what happened is, over time, both my views were changing, but also I felt the Republican Party was changing. Particularly for me, where I started moving away from the party was first on healthcare. I personally felt that, when Obama introduced what they called Obamacare, to me, that was very similar to the Mitt Romney plan in Massachusetts, to the Heritage Foundation plan. I thought that was a reasonable compromise between what Democrats and Republicans wanted to do. And so that the fact that the Republican Party was so obstinate in opposing it without really having their own counter proposal was one issue that I had. And then a bigger one was the Iraq, well, actually, I should say the first one was the Iraq War, which I was opposed to, Obamacare. And then the final nail in the coffin for me was climate change. As I started learning more about the dangers of climate change, and as the Republican Party became less and less interested in dealing with that issue, going from a John McCain, who was very active on climate, to Mitt Romney, who was a bit ambiguous, to Donald Trump, who says it's all a hoax, really was for me where I just couldn't, vote Republican anymore. And I also started changing views somewhat on issues of economic inequality, on how effective tax cuts are in really spurring growth. So I was moving away from the Republican Party, but at the same time, I didn't feel that I was ready to become a Democrat, because at the same time that was happening, it also looked like the Democratic Party was moving, to the left on a lot of things. Particularly, I think what bothers me is, restrictions on speech, the cancel culture mentality that you see on the far left, where there are other issues there as well. And so, it was really trying to figure, okay, can we do something that's different? That's something that's not, that's not going to be the cancel culture far left wing, but also not the Trumpian Republican Party. And so in the process of trying to find something different, I got involved first with a group called Unite America, which is trying to elect centrist independents to office. And when that wasn't working, I discovered SAM. And I think it's smarter to actually try to form a political party that can build a brand and that has organizational structure, rather than just trying to elect independents. And so then I got involved in the Stephanie Miner campaign and joined the state committee.
So on a personal journey, would you say the Republican Party's ideologies were drifting further apart from you, or were you drifting further away from the mainstream Republican Party?
I would definitely say it was a combination of both. My views were changing a lot on climate and economics, and at the same time, the Republican Party was actually moving also on those same issues, but in the opposite way that I was.
Yeah. And during the time when you were active, I guess, for the Republican Party ideas, did you find their policy platform on immigration to be acceptable, or was that too extreme?
So, my personal view on immigration is kind of something that doesn't really fit anywhere, because I think, the child separation policies, I think almost everyone, or most people, I should say, have issues with a lot of how, the immigration restrictions were carried out. However, I'm a child of a legal immigrant. I'm, on one hand, I'm very pro-immigration. I think particularly skilled immigration, it should almost be open borders. We should, screen for people with criminal backgrounds and ties to potential terrorist organizations. But beyond that, if you are a skilled immigrant, chances are over your lifetime, you will almost certainly contribute more in taxes than you're going to collect in benefits. You're going to contribute to the economy. That is a net win, I think, for America. And in fact, I see that there's a global competition for skilled labor. That being said, I don't think you can open the door for anyone to come in, because if you, allow basically importation of poverty, you're going to bankrupt our social safety net. And so to the extent that you want to have a social safety net, if you want to make sure everyone has healthcare, you can't let everyone in. And if you don't let everyone in, you have to have enforcement. So on the one hand, I'm very pro-immigration when it comes to skilled immigration. I think we should allow some unskilled immigrants in, particularly like a guest worker program, because we do have need in our economy, but you can't have unlimited immigration. And so I support any type of enforcement, both at the border, as well as, employer verification and other things to make sure that the laws are enforced. So I wasn't actually that alienated by the Republican Party on immigration, because I had a kind of a mixed view. I mean, I supported a lot of what they supported, but I also thought some of it went too far, particularly on restricting legal immigration, as some bills have said. But on the other hand, I didn't like that the Democrats didn't seem to want to enforce the law, or at least a lot of Democrat politicians. So that was not a deal breaker issue for me.
Okay. So if somebody from the outside looking in at SAM, and they might conflate SAM as being like this centrist organization, how would you differentiate like these centrist type third parties versus SAM? Other than, I know you mentioned about the policy reforms that they're trying to institute.
So in some ways, I mean, Sam officially doesn't like to say this, but I'll say it. I think we are kind of a centrist party, but the center is different with different districts. I think that the problem with so-called centrist parties is they create one idea of a center, which may or may not be the center of the country. But you don't realize that every area in America is different. Some states are more liberal and some states are more conservative. And so it always starts the idea that we believe that politicians should represent the views of their constituents. If you live in a very liberal district, you should represent those liberal views. If you're from a conservative district, you should represent those conservative views, but you should also be willing to listen to the other side, to compromise, and to work together. So it's kind of both, right? It's like we want people that are in the center of their districts and that are willing to work across the aisle.
When I first heard about SAM, it only took me just a few minutes of Google search to try to kind of nail down what SAM's policy platforms are. I know there's no official policy platform, but there is this one article that I came across. I think it was authored sometime in 2017 by Reed Galen. I'm not sure if he is still involved with SAM, but I think he's one of the strategists or founders. And this was kind of like the opening salvo. And they listed a whole bunch of different policy positions. And without going through every single one of them, it sounds like on economic issues, they're pretty right of center, like, on the issues of fiscal policies, debt, spending. But then on issues like investing in education, infrastructure, healthcare, they're more to the left of center. And then, they also cite things like criminal justice reform, which I guess it appeals to both parties these days. And then in some ways, it seems like they're also kind of rebuking the Trump's America First mindset. There's this reference to we're going to reject isolationism or retrenchment on the world stage. So it seems like when I first read that article, I thought, okay, maybe there is like some kind of an opening or electoral demand for a party that's more right of center on economic issues, but more left of center on social domestic issues. Is that a right characterization, you think? Or
so do you actually have that article? Because I would like to see it.
I'll post it, on the chat room.
Okay. Because that's not, so right now, it may have been that when Sam first started, there was an idea of creating a policy platform the way that you're describing. But as long as I've been involved with it, the decision has always been that Sam is not going to take specific policy positions on those types of issues. So even when I was talking about immigration and other things, I mean, that was where my positions, that's not a Sam position. And so I'd have to see the article to be able to respond. I don't know if that was something, again, that was in the past, or if Reed Galen was just talking on his own behalf.
Okay, well, while I post the article, I guess we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. So if you have any questions for Erik, please raise your hand and direct them at Erik. Anyone? Let's see, let's go with Sandy first.
I guess I was wondering, what are the main sources of your funding?
So the main sources of our funding are people basically who are individual contributors to SAM, because we're always looking to raise money. That's a struggle for us because we don't have power, right? There's nothing we can use to negotiate or bargain for. And we wouldn't want to be able to do that, right? But we're always probably going to be at a financial disadvantage. We also don't have like a billionaire backing us the way the Independence Party, when they started with Tom Golisano. And so we're just raising money, from people who want to be involved in the party and people that they know. The good news is we did have people that's joined that are politically connected. Like I said, we had staffers in from both the Bush and the Obama administrations, people in the business community. But I can't tell you that we have a lot of money, unfortunately. And that is a struggle that we have.
I mean, honestly, I'm a little happy to hear that, because I was afraid it was going to be another situation where wealthy donors were maybe dissatisfied with the Republican Party or something, and then they kind of migrated over to you to get their agenda focused. So I'm kind of glad to hear that's not the case. And I just want to make a comment about Michelle Cabruso Cabrera, because I live in District 14, which is AOC's district. And in the primary, MCC, Michelle Cabruso Cabrera, ran a very nasty campaign. She said I received many, many brochures and flyers in the mail. They had a lot of misinformation. It was deliberately misleading and very nasty. She was frequently accusing AOC of hiding out in her apartment and not being back here to help the community in the pandemic. And that is exactly the opposite of what has happened. AOC has been out there frequently with all kinds of food giveaways. I know because I actually help out at some of these. So it was kind of repulsive to keep getting this misleading lies in the mailers from MCC. So actually in our district, AOC is really beloved by the community because people say that she is there standing shoulder to shoulder with them in the worst of times and doing whatever it takes to make sure that they don't go hungry and that they have, help with a lot of different things. So, everything that MCC did really gave the district the impression that she's deceptive and a liar and just, a lot of really bad things. And so she lost by a landslide in the primary, and now she ended up on your ticket. So, I would just sort of suggest that you want to do a little due diligence on these candidates, and maybe you don't want somebody who is widely seen as a terrible and immoral person coming onto your ticket just because they're available. So she really has a very, very negative view in my district, I have to say.
Yeah, kind of like I was saying earlier, I haven't, to be totally honest, been following that election. I don't know even myself that much about Michelle Cabrera Caruso. It's not an election we are optimistic, obviously, about winning. So it hasn't really been something focused on us. So what I would say is this is why we want people involved in the party to help with that selection process. We do have a very small group in Queens. I don't know all the ins and outs of how they decided to endorse her. But whenever anyone comes and tells me that they don't like a particular candidate, what I consistently say, and I'm not just saying this about that particular race, but I say it all the time, is, hey, join us, and you could have an influence in choosing our candidates. But it's not like I'm the one selecting all the candidates, unfortunately.
Oh, I know.
But I agree with you that, yeah, I don't want to, again, I'm not saying I actually agree or disagree with anything you're saying because I haven't been following it. All I can say is, she was the one that the people that involved in SAM in that area chose. And, that it's not, we're not always going to agree. I think people even within SAM.
If I could just ask a follow-up question on the AOC primary race, because that's a really interesting phenomenon. I think this might expose some, I guess, inefficiencies of SAM in a sense that, look, AOC on, I guess, the national stage, maybe they might view her as very left. Some might even consider her to be too extreme on things like Green New Deal and other social domestic programs. But it seems like in her district, overwhelmingly popular. She won hands down. So maybe she's not taking such an extremist position. So maybe somebody like her is very well suited in her district. And maybe MCC coming in and challenging her, maybe that was just for the sake of challenging her. But, if somebody like AOC is very popular in the district, then maybe she is best suited to serve her community, no?
Yeah, I think an argument can be made. I'm not personally taking a position on that because I don't live in the district, but that's something for people within SAM to decide, to be totally honest. That we want people there interviewing the candidates, going through the process. And if there's more than one, for all I know, by the way, I don't even know if she sought our nomination, right? That's a whole nother aspect to it. But assuming that she did and both candidates wanted it, then there could also be a primary. And we've had that too. So I know I'm sounding very wishy-washy, to be totally honest, but I'm also just being honest that it's not, I don't live in the district. I didn't follow that particular race. It's more about, the process that we have. And is it perfect? No. But I also wouldn't want like our state committee making every single endorsement because that would also go against what Sam believes too. But yeah, to Thomas, to your point, you could definitely have a candidate. I think this is the larger point you're making that is very left-wing in terms of the national view, but for that district, she might be in the center, and that very well may be the case. I just don't even know enough about the district to say that.
Right, and I think this district might also expose another weakness in a sense that maybe a reform that Sam is trying to undertake makes sense because this district is so gerrymandered. It represents parts of Queens and the Bronx. So maybe there are certain constituents maybe living in the Bronx that may not be as left of AOC versus those living in Queens. I think that could be one argument too. So if the gerrymandering redistricting reforms were made, then maybe you could have a district that's better represented rather than having these kind of artificial areas where it's not fully represented. You can certainly make that argument too. So if they were to adopt some of the reform ideas coming from Sam, maybe through the gerrymandering reforms, you'll have a more balanced district, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think competitive districts in general are a good thing on both sides, because there are also districts that are drawn to be very, very conservative, right? And that elect very conservative people to office as well. And yeah, it would probably be better to have districts that are generally that make more sense in terms of how the borders are drawn. And as a result, they're probably going to be more balanced districts.
Okay, let's go to some other members. Let's go to Earl, then Ed. Go ahead, Earl.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, first, Thomas, a gentle correction. Bill Kristol has got an organization called Republicans for the Rule of Law. He does not make the ads for the Lincoln Project. Second of all, I know Reed, and I know why Reed left Sam. He considers it a lawyer's toy. It has a Mersey-Dotes and Dozy-Dotes agenda that is designed to be to not offend anybody, and everybody has to be for apple motherhood and apple pie. Reed decided that rather than trying to solve all the problems at once, much like some of the other guys in the Lincoln Project, they decided to band together and take on a major effort, which was to defeat Trump. I've been involved in a number of major third-party efforts. The first one was Ross Perot's United We Stand America, and I was closely involved in that. In a very short period of time, we got Ross on all 50 states. He was on the ballot. At one point, he was running second in the polls. We made our objective, which was to get the deficit on the agenda. Bill Clinton agreed with us and balanced the budgets. And then the next group of Republicans came in and blew the budget. And so I'm also familiar with how difficult it is to actually reform an individual aspect of the system. In that case, we were simply trying to enforce fiscal responsibility, which was in those days a Republican talking point. And that failed. The Lincoln Project, which I'm involved in, is attempting to reestablish the Republican Party on the old Republican principles: fiscal responsibility, strong foreign policy, family values, limited government. And it is not clear, even with the power that they have, and we've raised well over $60 million and max out our Zoom town halls and our YouTube attendees. So there's a huge mailing list and a huge group behind it. It's still not clear whether or not there's enough power there to actually organize change. I mean, inside the Lincoln Project, we talk about either Trump is going to get decimated and we have a chance of getting the Republican Party back to basic values, or it's going to be close and Biden's going to win and we're going to have to start an independent conservative party. The misgivings I have about this particular organization, and Eric, I'm not trying to denigrate it, because I've been involved. I mean, I've been on the front line since the Kennedy administration. Is that there's a great deal of talking, but in the time that you guys have been in existence, there doesn't seem to be much progress. And the mantra that we don't stand for anything and therefore you should stand with us doesn't seem to me to be rational. You get in exactly the situation that Sandy put you in, where you tout your process and the nature of your candidates, and then somebody comes forward and says, "Well, I'm in that district," and the person that you are putting forward is a pain in the ass and an ugly person. And I don't think you have the internal structure to actually do the vetting. I mean, at United We Stand, we put together a vast organization which carefully vetted every candidate that joined our slate. It's a huge job. You can't do it on a limited budget. Final point, if you don't have a tent post, if you don't have a tent pole in an organization, you're not likely to succeed. Ross was our tent post, and his checking account was our tent post. And the Lincoln Project, we have tent posts, we have major donors, and we are raising from individual donors. But if the money doesn't come in, you just end up eventually just talking to yourself. And I don't mean to be overly negative on this, but final point, Erik, a giveaway on a Republican who's trying to hide himself is they refer to them as Democrat politicians. They're Democratic politicians. Just as a fun thing, in case you haven't picked it up, you can always tell a Republican who's trying to hide, because they say, "Well, a Democrat politician said this," and it's a slight that in Republican circles is designed to denigrate the Democratic Party. Anyway, I'm sorry to wander on, but but I'm fairly passionate and involved in this kind of stuff for a long time, including, by the way, the movement Scottish Independence. Go Unicorn.
A few things. First of all, it's funny, I got my interest in politics because of Ross Perot in 1992. I was only 13 years old at the time, but that's what got me involved in politics. I volunteered for his campaign. I went door to door collecting signatures to get him on the ballot. And that was kind of my entrance point to politics. So I get where you're coming from. And, to the point that Sandy asked about money and to your point about Perot being the tentpole, as much as I was saying we don't have a billionaire like Perot or Golisano, to be honest, it would be nice to have one, right? We don't. And I do think what you're saying is the point. It is the difficulty that we have, that we don't have the resources, financially even, of the Lincoln Project, that have a lot more resources than we do. I think it's probably our biggest challenge. I do think it's also a challenge that because people are used to parties that are ideological, it's even if it's a centrist party, like to some extent Perot's Reform Party was, that to say that we don't have an ideology at all is confusing to people. I do get that. I think the hope is that we can attract people who want to fix the system across the spectrum, but we does have the risk of turning people off who would prefer a party that is more ideological. So I understand the downsides that you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree with them. There was a last point that you made, and now I forgot what it is. But yeah, I don't actually even disagree with what you're saying.
The one point I wanted you to respond to is, if your maxim is we don't stand for anything but stand with us, that seems to me to be a difficult message to get troops to gather around.
Yeah, I guess the question is ideology the only thing you can stand for? And maybe, right? And I think for a lot of people that's true. The hope is that there's enough people that care about fixing the system. So it's almost like, if you have a choice between a candidate that you agree with more on ideology, but is not committed to fixing the system, and a candidate who is, but maybe you don't agree with as much, where are your priorities? And to me, fixing the system needs to be the first priority. And I guess that's the difference. If you want to understand, we're not saying that we're all things to all people, because not everyone is going to have that as their first priority. But for those people that do, like, that's the thing. Thing is that our argument is you can't fix these other problems, or at least it'll be a lot harder given the broken system we have. So let's fix the system, and then we can then proceed on these other issues. But not everyone's going to agree with that. So your point's taken. Oh, I remember what I wanted to say now. Your point about, that me saying Democrat politicians is reflective of my past. It's not me trying to hide. It is probably just, it's like having an accent that shows you where you came from.
Just want to ask a question about how this would play out conceivably in Congress. So let's say you have a whole slew of candidates that come in during like a midterm election on the SAM party, okay? Mm-hmm. And right now in Congress, yes, it's a two-party system, but essentially you have four parties. What I mean by that is you have Democrats and Republicans, and each party has like an activist wing. So the Democrats have the Progressive Caucus, the likes of AOC and others. And then you have on the Republican side, the Freedom Caucus, which used to be called the Tea Party caucus, but now it's the Freedom Caucus. And they're the activist wing of their respective party. So then if you have a slew of candidates coming in on SAM ticket, what role would they have in Congress? Because you have to build coalitions, and you have committee assignments, and you have to work with other delegations. So what would their role be?
Well, I think first question is, are they just SAM candidates, or are they Democrats or Republicans who have been endorsed by SAM? Because if they're a SAM only candidate, essentially they're like an independent. And there's a couple, Bernie Sanders, funny enough, is an independent. There's also, my mind is blanking on his name from
Angus King.
Yes, yes, Angus King, right, from Maine. And it's so, yeah, I mean, it would be a challenge, right, in terms of not having the benefits of the party structure, but they could also be a swing vote on a lot of issues where both parties are trying to get that person's support to vote on their side. But even if there are a member of the party, let's say they're a Democrat or Republican, and they're also a Sam endorsed candidate, then we would expect them to champion, political reform, regardless of their party, and to follow this process of transparency and accountability and working across the aisle. And if they don't, then chances are they're probably not going to, be renominated by us. And so that's the whole thing, is we're trying to use this line as a way of leverage, right, of pushing candidates to better represent their constituents. Maybe that's the ultimate way to look at it.
Okay, let's go to the next questions. Ed, then Ralph.
Okay, hey, thank you, Eric. The concept is very fascinating, but I'm in my late 60s, so I'm kind of the senior person here, and I know quite a bit about New York electoral history. I remember the Conservative Party started in 62, getting a little more than 50,000 votes. 8 years later, it elected a US senator and got more votes than the Democratic or Republican Party. I remember John Lindsay being elected on the Liberal Party line in 1969. There's a history of back in the 30s and the 40s, American Labor Party getting a whole slew of congressmen and state representatives. This New York is unusual in that respect, that it has had these relatively stable third parties, especially the Conservative Party was very successful. The Liberal Party was involved with the Ladies Garment Workers Union, very union oriented. And that was around for quite a while. But you see these, and then we had the another party that came out of nowhere was the Right to Life Party, and they got 130,000 votes in 1978, I believe, and they got a position on the ballot. And then later on, you had Tom Golisano and the Independents. However, these historical third parties were very much ideologically driven to a very great extent, and the people felt the ideology was going to correct the system rather than any other kind of mechanism. This is what was basically thought. Now, I looked at some of the members of that are running for office that you list, and I know some of them are very conservative, upstate people, and then liberal liberal Democratic types in New York City. And it just, to me, seems to be sort of irrational. Like, I know one guy who you list who's a state senator outside of Buffalo, and he would have nothing in common with the New York Democrats. He'd be relatively anti-gay and very, very different from what you would expect. A candidate would be in New York. So the thing is, it's just so amorphous, and I think more people would be looking at ideology to drive change than anything else. And that's the way that I would look at it. It just seems that it's just too, the concept is very interesting, and I applaud you for, your activity here. But just kind of the history that I know is that people kind of lean towards the ideology, and it's going to be hard to have a party where you have, a right-wing guy in upstate New York, and then 100 miles away, a very liberal fellow having totally different points of view, except wanting to change, elements of the system, like with gerrymandering and such. I think, your goal is good, but people will, I can't see it succeeding because ideology essentially drives the third party movements, and that's especially the history in New York, as I look at it. So I don't know what you have to say about that.
Well, I think, I half agree with you in the sense that I do think that people that are very politically active, like people who would probably participate in these types of forums, but also people politically active in general. The people that volunteer in campaigns, that donate money, tend to be more ideological. And it is hard to get a party like this started because I think the people that are not ideological, I think the majority of people, if I had to guess, are not very ideological, but also not very active in politics. So I agree with you in the sense that it is the challenge that we face, that the people who agree with us are the least likely to be volunteering on campaigns, donating money, and being active in the process. And people that are very ideological tend to be. That is a challenge. My only hope is that we can find enough people who are active, who are not ideological, to make a difference. I think especially in, again, with these swing districts where even a small percentage of people voting on our line could, swing the election one way or another.
I just want to say that these several of these candidates from upstate New York are very ideological in the conservative side, quite ideological. And from what I could see, the couple of ones in the New York area would be liberal, and these people are not, centrist. That the ones that I noticed they're not centrist at all. They lean to one side or the other, and it's not like being a Rockefeller Republican, which at one time I was, when we had Jacob Javits and Nelson Rockefeller, and they were as liberal as almost any Democrat. But it's a very different world today, and there is, I just can't see how a party with such a wide ideological swing really can kind of stay together, especially without any great donor like a Golisano or someone like that can infuse a tremendous amount of money. So it just seems to me that it would not likely be a success.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Erik, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I know. I think he makes a good point saying that, yeah, we have more liberal candidates in the city. We have more conservative candidates upstate. It's not to say that the candidates can't be ideological. The whole goal is really to try to get candidates. And again, it's not always achieved, but the goal is to try to get candidates that both fit their district and support these reforms. I am hoping that these reforms and fixing the system is enough to hold the party together and enough to attract enough people. Do I know for a fact it will be? I realize it's an uphill battle. I can't lie about that. It's a huge uphill battle. It's always been, for every third party is an uphill battle, even the ideological ones.
Okay, let's go to Ralph next. Go ahead, Ralph.
Okay. I have to admit I missed 20 minutes of your presentation, Erik, because I was called away on a phone call. It's a very attractive idea to have more of a centrist-oriented politics, which is very much in favor of crossing the aisle. There is a problem-solving caucus in the House of Representatives, with 25 Republicans and 25 Democrats. And I think they've come up with a very good formula for COVID relief. They're so far they haven't been able to get anywhere, and it's kind of frustrating. Me myself, I used to consider myself very much a left liberal. Nowadays, when I think of the so-called progressive firebrands, I see I'm a very moderate liberal. I'm still a liberal, but I can think back to Rockefeller and Javits and Eisenhower, although I was I was very much a kid during the Eisenhower administration. these were basically centrists, and then in the 90s you had Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton really did try to cultivate a reasonable, the idea of triangulation, which drives left liberals nuts, but it was really an honest attempt to move the country forward in a reasonable, moderate way, but really getting progress, in terms of reducing the deficit, trying to get some sort of national health care, failed with that, I think largely because Hillary didn't know how to negotiate with Congress. And now it's really the Republican Party ever since the Bill Clinton years, because they didn't look at him as a moderate that they could really deal with and deal with make progress in terms of the country's problems. And the Republican Party has become very, very extreme. So I don't know how we get to now I'm thinking, well, Biden, of course. Biden to me probably represents the best possibility of, on the national level, coming to some reasonable, liberal but moderate center, which hopefully could get this country back to some sort of reasonable place. And I'm very happy to see somebody who's involved with the Lincoln Project here. The Lincoln Project, it just I find very refreshing. And I'm very pleased to dialogue or to listen to Republicans and conservatives who understand the danger that Trumpism represents to the Republic. And, people like Charlie Sykes, and, better than I. On this local level and the whole thing, I don't know. I say good luck to you, but, I kind of don't quite see it. I don't quite understand it. I mean, if you had to crystallize policy in terms of the actual reforms that you want to see, while standing on one foot, what would it be? What would they be? Like 1, 2, 3.
If I can only pick 3.
3 or 5,
All right. Okay. I would say ranked choice voting would be one, because I think it opens up the system to more competition. I think doing open primaries, I think fighting gerrymandering and campaign finance, stronger campaign finance reform, like some type of public financing of campaigns would be the 4, I guess, that I would choose. Right now.
If I can just add, Eric, I helped set up the Scottish Parliament, which is on a proportional voting basis.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 2 kinds of ministers in the Scottish Parliament, one elected from the district and the other selected from the party list. The results of that has been the domination of the Scottish National Party, but the minor parties have not grown as a result of the proportional representation system that is employed in Scotland. One of the things that the minor parties hoped was that they would get larger and more important as a result. That has not happened. I mean, I just wanted to give you that data point because I've been involved ever since the referendum passed, and we designed the parliament at Holyrood.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the hope that it would make third parties more competitive, but also aside from that, I mean, you could have a candidate that gets elected with less than a majority of the vote, um, because of the way that the votes split out. And I think that itself is a problem, right? You may have someone that wins with 47% of the vote, where 53% of the voters would prefer not to have that candidate. So even just avoiding those situations, like alone, right? Even setting aside I mean, if you go back, I don't know how people feel about I'm just thinking of this one, the 2000 presidential election, Gore versus Bush. And now, of course, that's an electoral college is another factor in there. But just looking at the popular vote, or even under the electoral college, right? A lot of the concern is that that Ralph Nader might have cost Gore the election. We don't know. I mean, and maybe with a ranked choice voting, Nader probably would not have won anyway. But maybe that would have helped Al Gore beat Bush, which could have changed the course of history. Whether you think it's good or bad, it's probably a more reflective outcome of what the voters actually wanted, considering chances are, I think more people at the end of the day would have preferred Gore over Bush, assuming, again, that the Nader people would have more likely chosen Gore over Bush as their second choice. So it's not purely about helping elect third parties. I think it's also just making the system more fair.
Okay.
But to Ralph's point about the problem-solving caucus, I think one of the reasons they haven't gotten a lot of traction is because, again, going back to the idea that the system is so broken, that you have so many members of Congress that are elected in these gerrymandered districts where there's no incentive to try to work across the aisle and appeal to the middle at all. Then, of course, you get big money in there, and that's a whole nother, all of these things kind of are different aspects of it.
So speaking of big money, I know you had mentioned that there's no litmus test, but if somebody were to propose that Sam will officially require all the candidates to take a pledge to never accept a super PAC money, do you think that will be too restrictive, or is that something the organization could get behind?
I think the issue with that, and I'm just talking off the top of my head, right? I can't say I'm speaking for Sam right now, is that given the fact that your opponents are, raising money through super PACs, I mean, we do have to think about transparency. So transparency is an absolute must. You have to at least disclose. But if this is a competitive race, and do we want to be handicapping the candidates that are actually trying to fix the system by not allowing them to raise money in that way? I mean, that would be the concern, like I would think of, which is why I think it's more important to actually pass laws that restrict what everyone can do, and make the playing more field. Because I don't want a situation where our candidates, again, I don't think transparency puts you at a disadvantage, because the idea is that hopefully we have candidates that are not going to be embarrassed by who their donors are. But to say that you simply cannot raise money in a way that your opponents can, like, my concern would be putting these reform candidates in that disadvantage. I can't say everyone in Sam's going to agree with that, though.
Sure. It's kind of one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemmas. And that same dilemma was posed during the 2008 presidential election, where John McCain wanted to rely on public financing, but candidate Obama said no, because I need to get elected so that I could change the law. And we know what happened. He decided to forego public financing, which meant he accepted millions of dollars from Wall Street, and the rest is history. And then, of course, the poetic justice to that part is then Citizens United decision got handed down. So anyway. Okay, any other questions for Erik? Well, I have some questions. So I know before I talked about, what are some of the priorities for Sam? Does it make sense? Because I think I kind of likened it to Working Families Party in New York. And do you think it makes sense that Sam should maybe focus more on either local or regional efforts as opposed to national? And I say that because if you look at the Working Families Party, they are very successful and effective on the local level, from city council all the way to the state lawmakers.
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation, but in general, I agree with you that it's easier. I think for third parties to be effective at the local level, because when you don't have a lot of money, what you can do is, do more of a grassroots effort, right? The higher you go, the more money matters. The problem, of course, right now with COVID, it's harder to even do a lot of door knocking and in-person events. So in general, that's true, but I don't want to say that well, first of all, we have, even if we get this law overturned, we have to run candidates in the gubernatorial election that are going to get the 50,000 votes to stay on the ballot. So we can't ignore at least the governor's election. We're obviously, we're going to still run candidates, but that's why we're not running a presidential candidate, because it's not yet a national effort. It is still state by state.
Okay. If I could just offer an unsolicited, advice to Sam. I know this is purely, gratuitous and unsolicited, but and the premise to what I'm about to say goes like this. We had a book club discussion on Ezra Klein's book. It's called Why We Are So Polarized. And his thesis is that we have this vicious cycle where everything is based on identity based on, religion, race, gender, etc. And the part of that vicious circle is identity plus big media that kind of portrays everything in this, mainstream spotlight. So it's really hard to infiltrate other new ideas or somebody new. And the reason why I say that is maybe Sam or organizations like Sam could recruit celebrities. Why celebrities? Because if you're not running candidates on ideas, like, again, if you look at AOC, she's running for, on platforms like Green New Deal, and other very kind of populist ideas. Maybe you could have celebrities, like, let's say, I don't know, Beyonce. Why Beyonce? Because she has a name recognition. You could make these reforms very glamorous, because media would certainly, it's a very attention grabbing kind of an effort. And somebody like Beyonce, or in that kind of celebrity stature, doesn't need to rely on fundraising, because they are independently financially secure. So that would get rid of the transparency problem, campaign financing problem, and this kind of lack of enthusiasm based on process problem, because then you could have the celebrity attention spotlight, but run on policy reforms. So I think that could be one idea, for whatever that's worth.
No, you're right, because there's another group, I don't know if you're familiar with Represent Us, that they're not a political party, but they're supporting a lot of these same political reforms. And their whole thing is they're nonpartisan, non-ideological. And they did a campaign with Jennifer Lawrence that was incredibly successful and got a lot of them attention. And I look, hey, if you know any celebrities that are willing to help Sam out, let me know, or any billionaires for that matter.
Okay.
Just to follow up on Thomas's comment, the Lincoln Project decided not to go down that road. And what these guys from Reed and Rick and Mike and all these guys, their mantra is, you got to have steel in your eyes and steel in your guts, and you've got to convince everybody that you believe in what you're doing, and you're doing it with intentionality. And those ads that have been mentioned a couple of times here are our celebrity. People go and watch those ads over and over again. And I think the reason the Lincoln Project has succeeded is that there's absolutely no doubt in people's minds that these guys mean what they say, and they are going to drive through the wall to get there. I mean, they mean business. They are serious. And the people who donate to us because they see the ads and they see the response in the White House, and they know damn well that every one of these team members here is deadly serious about getting this done. It's the intentionality, the immediacy, and attention in that organization which is driving it.
But so one thing I do want to say here is, and this is just across all political organizations, the reality is, and I'm not saying anything pro or con to Lincoln Project or Represent Us or any groups, is you use the resources you have. And I applaud the Lincoln Project. The reality is they do have a lot of funding to run the ads that they're running. Represent Us has not just Jennifer Lawrence, other celebrities that they've used. We have a ballot line. you use what you have. And so, look, in an ideal world, you'd have all of these things, but that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, anyone else before we wrap it up? Well, Erik, before we sign off, let me kind of put you on a spot to maybe have you think on your feet a little bit. Politics is all about persuasion. So let's say if there is a proverbial elevator pitch moment, right? So you run into a disaffected independent voter, maybe first-time voter, a young voter, and they ask you, well, tell me in 10 seconds, what is and what does Sam do? Again, if someone were to describe the Republican Party, they'll say, well, patriotism, family values, tradition. Democrats will say, well, being progressive and equality, justice. What is the essence of Sam, if you could distill it down to just like a few words?
I think the essence of Sam is helping to elect candidates who are committed to fixing our broken political system and actually representing their constituents.
Okay.
If you're going to give me 10, a short time, that's how I'd say it.
Okay, well, I guess that'll be all. Just on a programming note, our next meetup is going to be in 2 days on Wednesday, and it's going to be a live Oxford debate. And Erik will be one of the debaters on the debate stage. So we look forward to that. Otherwise, Erik, thank you once again for taking the time. And I'll put a link to Sam's website on our meetup page. Please do check it out. Once again, thanks everyone for attending. Be well. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. Hang in there.
Thank you.